material we've been looking at, is the basic nature of reality, and I suppose the answers to our biggest scientific puzzles, something that emerges from a kind of universal, almost abstract information structure, or does it absolutely require unique, specific physical building blocks? So the question we're posing is this: do we achieve unity, both in the cosmos and maybe even in cognition, by seeing reality as an emergent, substrate-neutral information structure? This is what we're calling the PSUMOT framework. Or do we have to validate the necessity of unique biologically and physically constrained substrates? My position, well, it leans towards the first option. I think unification comes from this information-first perspective, where the nitty-gritty details of space-time and matter are, in a sense, secondary. They're defined by the patterns.
And I'm taking the opposing view. Look, the idea of a purely informational reality, substrate neutral, it is elegant, I grant you that, compelling even. But when you look closely at the actual facts of existence, particularly the mechanics of life, of consciousness, it seems inextricably tied to very specific physical necessities. So I'm arguing that these unique physical substrates, they aren't just secondary features. They are the bedrock, the irreducible foundation that allows these informational patterns to even exist reliably in the first place.
Position statements. Okay, let's start out there with the cosmos. The fact that we still have these major cosmological crises, well, I think it structurally validates the failure of the current, more fragmented models like lambda CDM. I mean, think about the biggest black hole anomaly. You have these huge objects forming way too early in the universe. And, crucially, the Hubble tension crisis. This is where our local and our distant measurements of cosmic expansion just fundamentally disagree. These aren't small issues. They signal, I think, the limits of treating space-time as some kind of fundamental smooth background. Now, the PSUMOT framework, it's really designed to address these systemic failures. It does this by synthesizing three, let's say, advanced theoretical ideas. Superfluid cosmology, the idea that space-time is like a quantum fluid, the holographic principle suggesting reality is information projected essentially onto a boundary, and loop quantum gravity, which posits that space-time itself is quantized. It comes in discrete chunks. The synthesis of these posits that the universe emerges from a universal quantum superfluid substrate. What this means then is that gravity, mass, even black holes, they get redefined as emergent phenomena. Black holes, in this view, aren't singularities in the classical sense, but more like quantized vortex cores, topological defects really, stabilized by the fluid's properties. This shift, it transforms physics. It moves us away from trying to constantly patch up a broken space-time model towards hopefully a predictive science rooted entirely in the collective dynamics of this underlying information.
Right. I appreciate the drive for unification. It makes sense. But when you really zoom in on organized complexity, and life is the prime example, this elegance of a substrate-neutral information theory, well, it starts to fall short. It overlooks mechanisms that seem absolutely essential. My position really hinges on the necessity of unique physical substrates. Just consider the absolute mandate of homochirality. All life on Earth relies exclusively on L-amino acids and D sugars. That's a specific uniform molecular handedness, a twist. And this specific uniform twist, it's described as a functional imperative. Without that specific chirality, complex, stable biological molecules just can't form reliably. It prevents things like proper protein folding, forming the long informational chains needed for complex computation, like DNA, and the critical element here, the physics, behind it, is the chiral-induced spin selectivity effect, CISS.
Now, this strongly suggests that the unique geometry of the substrate gives biology a specialized room-temperature quantum causal power. A power that pure computation on a, say, non-chiral substrate like standard silicon might intrinsically lack. So the substrate matters. It dictates which specific quantum tools are even available.
Okay, I see why you're emphasizing the chemical specificity. That's fair. But the need for a unified informational framework, I'd argue, is really confirmed by looking at the cosmos itself. The power of PSUMOT's suit, its capacity to offer coherent physicalist solutions to these major anomalies we talked about, that's precisely what strengthens its claim to universality. Let's go back to the Hubble tension crisis, because standard lambda CDM really struggles to give a convincing answer there. PSUMOT explains this discrepancy not as some kind of breakdown of fundamental laws. No, it frames it as a predictable consequence of non-uniform, turbulent, superfluent flow. In this emergent reality picture, massive structures in the cosmos, galaxies, clusters, they act like, well, rocks in the river, essentially. They disrupt the flow, challenging that idealized perfect fluid assumption that's kind of baked into lambda CDM. This turbulence naturally creates localized variations in the apparent expansion rate, and that mirrors pretty closely the different values we measure using different techniques. This predictable ability, turning a cosmological crisis into a predictable outcome of complex unified dynamics, that's compelling evidence, I think, that reality is ultimately defined by these emergent patterns.
I'm sorry, but I just don't quite buy that the rocks in the river analogy proves the physical reality of a superfluid universe on that scale. Yes, the mathematical similarity between hydrodynamic models and cosmological phenomena is intellectually neat, it's attractive, but mathematical resemblance doesn't automatically equal physical identity, does it? For the PSUMOT framework to really work, especially the idea of black holes being vortex cores, those defects would need to have formed during a very specific, very early universe phase transition. Yet the Planck 2018 CMB observations, our best data on the early universe, seem to severely limit the parameter space for creating such macroscopic topological defects. So if the cosmological application itself is restricted, how can it really be the grand unifying framework you propose? And furthermore, if we look at recent empirical data, like the detection of that smallest dark matter ball, about 1 million solar masses, found using combined radio telescopes, that finding is currently being interpreted quite coherently through existing standard dark matter models, whether particle-based or otherwise. So why should we suddenly pivot to a radical emergent framework when new data points are still being arguably successfully categorized by more conventional particle theories? The empirical constraints, they seem to favor sticking with specific mechanisms within existing models, at least for now, rather than jumping to the grand unifying pattern.
But I think that focuses perhaps too narrowly on the limitations of specific analogies within the framework, rather than the overarching unifying principle. The fact remains, the traditional model requires this enormous dark matter, dark energy, to explain cosmic structure and mass. PSUMOT offers a unified explanation where mass, gravity, structure formation from the biggest black holes down to the smallest dark matter concentrations, they're all governed by the same turbulent topological rules of the underlying substrate. The detection of new structure, well, it simply means standard model scientists are interpreting new data through familiar particle-based lenses. The information theoretic approach argues the pattern defines the particle, not the other way around.
Okay, but let's follow that logic. If we agree, just for argument's sake, that information defines reality in the cosmos, does that same principle hold true when we look at the most complex informational structure we actually know, the human mind? Because I'd argue that even there, the constraints of the physical substrate are the defining factor. If your informational pattern model is universally correct, why is the CISS effect, this unique quantum spin filtering mechanism, tied to life's chiral molecules? Why is it even necessary? Surely you can't just separate the resilience of the informational pattern from the specific physical structure that enables its stability.
That is a compelling argument, I admit. But I'd counter that the organization of information, its geometry, its topology, is what provides a kind of resilience that can, perhaps, transcend the local chemistry. The source material itself shows that neural systems encode vital information using geometric properties, moving beyond just classical neurological wiring. Take grid cells, for example, which are crucial for spatial navigation and memory. Their activity resides on what's mathematically described as a toroidal manifold, essentially the surface of a donut shape. Now, this isn't just some arbitrary structure. It seems to represent a biological implementation of topologically protected state representations. What that means conceptually is that memory persists through geometric invariance, through topological closure. This makes it incredibly stable against, say, local physical damage or noise. The brain appears to use geometry itself to protect its information.
And this inherent preference for stable geometric structure, well, it mirrors the kind of emergent topology we're talking about in the cosmos under PSUMOT, suggesting maybe a universal informational preference.
But how is that topology sustained biologically? You're describing a magnificent architectural pattern, yes, but the CISS effect I mentioned, that might be the very mechanism that allows that pattern to be sustained biologically at body temperatures with such incredible energy efficiency. If that specific molecular handedness acts as an electron spin filter, maybe granting unique quantum causal powers, well, then the substrate seems absolutely foundational. It's the constraint. If the system were truly substrate-neutral, shouldn't we expect to see these topological states being maintained with the same robustness in radically different, non-chiral materials at room temperature? We don't, do we? The physical necessity of that chiral twist seems to enable the informational coherence you prize.
You know, this discussion flows quite naturally into the final area, where the organization of information becomes a critical defense mechanism, protecting the integrity of knowledge itself, preventing what the source calls memory rot within the mind. If the brain's internal structure relies on these topologically protected states, what happens when that system fails internally?
That's a fantastic transition. Yes, because this is where the debate over pattern versus constraint becomes deeply practical, I think.
Exactly. So my stance here is that cognitive failure, this memory rot, the inability to function coherently, it often happens when the mind gets trapped in chaotic, low-variety states. It's described as an induced R strategy, where complexity and nuance are actively avoided. The key defense against this kind of self-seeing knowledge as a structural pattern, it requires analytical discipline. We see this exemplified in the cliché technique mentioned in the sources. It's a rigorous analytical process. You consciously separate objective reality, column 1, just the bare facts of an event, from the paralyzing emotional coloring, the column 2 stuff, which holds the cliché, the shame, the fear of failure, the catastrophic thinking. By enforcing this strict, low-variety factual accounting, you essentially restore the mind's functional coherence. You prevent the self-sabotage that can happen, especially in systems that tend to pathologize high-variety, complex minds. So the stability of the informational pattern is maintained by disciplined knowledge.
Okay, that's a compelling argument for defending against internal self-sabotage. But what about the immediate, arguably more acute threat to knowledge integrity today? I'm talking about external manipulation and false memory implantation. This is a form of acute memory rot imposed from the outside. We know from psychological studies that complex false memories can be implanted through simple suggestion. People can even be convinced they committed crimes that never actually happened. Now amplify that threat with AI-generated content, deepfake videos, realistic fake images, being used to make people genuinely believe things happened when they absolutely did not. If the foundational record of the self, that internal informational pattern you value, can be so easily corrupted by external technological or social forces, then relying solely on internal analytical discipline seems, well, insufficient. The defense against this external rot seems to require strict adherence to external evidence, to non-abstracted recording of the self. You almost have to assume your internal memory will forget or be corrupted. You have to write it down, externalize the factual account immediately before social reinforcement or technological manipulation or even just cognitive reframing takes place. In this case, the unique external physical substrate, the recording, the document, becomes the ultimate arbiter of integrity, doesn't it?
But isn't that very act of writing down, of externalizing the record, isn't that itself an application of the analytical discipline I was talking about? It is enforcing a low-variety factual accounting against the high-variety chaos of imagination, suggestion, and social influence. That discipline, that knowledge that you need an accurate record, is precisely what protects the informational structure, whether internal or externalized. The method of recording, I'd argue, is secondary to the knowledge driving the need for that record in the first place.
That's true. It is an application of knowledge. But that knowledge only becomes functional, I think,
if we acknowledge the inherent vulnerability of the internal substrate to external force. The defense strategy is rooted in recognizing the physical necessity of the external record. And we also have to contend with the strange historical contingency of knowledge itself. I mean, think about Descartes, the inventor of systematic doubt, the father of modern rationalism. His entire framework arguably found its footing, its initial conviction, based on interpreting a profoundly irrational, mystical dream experience. It shows that the unique, specific, sometimes fragile origins of knowledge can be just as crucial as its subsequent systematic application. The substrate of history matters too.
Well, I think this debate really illustrates that whether we're looking out at the cosmos or inwards at the mind, finding unity seems to require moving beyond conventional reductionism. The PSUMOT framework in physics and maybe topological memory research and cognition, they both suggest, I believe, that reality is best defined by emergent, integrated informational patterns that can transcend the classical constraints of spacetime and perhaps even local substrate chemistry. The consistent failure of fragmented models seems to demand we take that leap towards an information-theoretic foundation.
And yet, we must be careful not to mistake elegant mathematical analogies or the sheer convenience of abstract informational models for the full physical reality. The functional constraints, the irreducible chirality of life, the specific ways memory fails, even the strange historical contingency of rationalism's origin that I mentioned, they all demonstrate, I argue, that unique substrate properties and precise physical mechanisms remain critically necessary. We can't just abstract them away if we want to truly understand the complexity of existence.
So the source material really pushes us to consider this core tension. Is the foundation of our knowledge of reality itself a universal, self-organizing pattern that underlies everything, just waiting for disciplined analysis to uncover its rules?
Or is existence fundamentally predicated on a series of incredibly specific, unique physical and historical necessities? Necessities that must be respected as irreducible, foundational facts that constrain what is even possible.
And grappling with that distinction between the universal pattern and the necessary constraint, that's likely what should guide further exploration of the material. It certainly offers a richer, more complex way to understand both the universe and perhaps the limits of our own minds.
Indeed. It forces us to ask some pretty tough questions about just how far we can, or should, abstract reality away from its physical, messy, contingent grounding.